For all your listeners, the number one thing you can do out there is go to your local community college and support your local programs. You're going to find the most dedicated students that want to do this. They want this so bad. They'll work a part-time job, they'll work a full-time job, they'll work a night job and go to school. Some of your best future employees and some of the best future practitioners are sitting in those classrooms. So those schools need your support. They need your funds. I appreciate you funding your alma mater. Why don't you go to your local community colleges and see if you can support those next generation of students coming up?
Imagine if you didn't need a six-figure debt to become an architect. Today's guest, Joseph Lucido, president of the Coalition of Community College Architectural Programs and chair at Palomar College, is leading a bold shift in how we teach and fund architecture. In fact, he's helping students earn bachelor's degrees for under $20,000. In this episode, we talk about how to make architecture education affordable again, why the next generation must blend design with construction realities, the shift from star architects to collaborative builders, and what the new architect looks like in the age of AI and sustainability. If you care about the future of architecture or the future of education, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I have a really special guest, Joseph Lucido. He's the president of Coalition of the Community College Architectural Programs, so architecture department chair and professor at Palomar College. Besides spending decades designing, he's at the forefront of education, and I cannot be more excited to dive in today. Joseph, thanks for joining me.
Well, Jose, thank you so much. I love the podcast. I love what you're doing, and I really enjoy the conversations you bring to the forefront.
I am extremely excited to talk about one of your number one missions in terms of cost of education and affordability, specifically in the School of Architecture. But for now, take us back. Before we get into there, you fell in love with buildings at a certain point. Take us all the way back. How was that and why buildings?
Okay, I'm going to make you laugh. I was a graphic illustrator for a landscape architectural firm in Florida. I would normally be rendering graphics. That was back in the day, airbrush, markers, and I would do golf courses mainly. Then I went out to the job site and I realized everything I rendered still had to grow. So the effect of landscape architecture took so long to see the final product. I was just shocked, but I do love it and I did enjoy it. So I pivoted over to built form once I saw that. My first real forte in construction and architecture, and I will always credit this individual, is from Stephen Boshinsky, my father-in-law. He's a general contractor. So when I chose to go to Woodbury to continue on my education for a bachelor's of architecture, I would sit at his kitchen table every night and draft buildings. And then I would go out and assist him in framing and building and pouring concrete.
Wow.
He was a real estate developer at the time, so we would finance and build our own projects as we're doing that. That dichotomy between an architectural education, which was phenomenal, and physically building the products that I was drawing was a great stepping stone for where I'm at today, which is this pragmatic approach to architecture and this idea that you can really build the things that you love.
What was that next stepping stone? So from drafting, kind of walking onto the job sites, with the family, what was that springboard after that?
Well, then I went from basically getting my degree at Woodbury. I worked at multiple firms throughout Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And then I had an opportunity to transition to San Diego and continue on with my education. I have a master's of real estate and development in architecture, the MRAD program at Woodbury once again. I started to finance and build my own projects, including multifamily and single family homes. So it's that total culmination of, learning from that kitchen table drafting, going to a school, learning how to finance and build my own projects, and then taking that information into a classroom to kind of help shape that curriculum to the next generation of students. What is needed in that curriculum, and then what is some of those holdovers that don't necessarily transfer to today's built world.
Right. Well, so today, fast forward, you have the advantage of over 15 plus years of experience. From today to when you started, what's the most noticeable difference in the way that we've taught architecture today versus, say, what was it back in 2010?
Well, Jose, we chatted about this before. To me, an architectural education is a powerful tool. It gives us the ability to think, to create, to design, to problem solve. But the cost of that education is so staggering that it becomes a yoke around someone's neck. So we have this amazing ability to create positive and powerful thinkers. But then we settle them with a burden of $150,000+ worth of debt. And we send them out into an industry and say, well, you'll figure it out. And I don't believe in that. I don't believe that the return on investment is there at times if you don't give me the tools that I'm going to use in the office place on Tuesday. So it's this balance between this powerful education and the cost of this education. And the question really is, what does an architect do at the office? There's theoretical conversations, which are powerful tools, but we also have to understand that that young student who's going to come out needs to practice. There is the component of actually building the building, that life and safety component of understanding your responsibilities to the client, to the authority having jurisdiction or whomever. So it's always that question between, what are we providing our students? What are they getting? The cost at which they're paying to get this and the return on investment for that education. It's been a driving factor in my own personal life. And it's why I really started to transition to education, because I had an opportunity to make a difference in that arena.
Right, right. To zoom out, so amidst us addressing the affordability issue with education, I think selfishly, I'm personally interested to hear your thoughts on the mechanics around that. But also, we're navigating a fast and just quickly changing environment where technology, AI, just the practice of architecture is evolving in and of itself. Just to kind of break this down, so the affordability is one thing, the practice is evolving quickly, and just like what it means to be an architect is quickly evolving. It's a lot. It's a lot kind of to tackle at one time. Maybe on the affordability front, what are some of the mechanics that we should be aware of? Like, how can we start to make a dent around just the cost of education? And then perhaps maybe that leads into just like what is the changing role of college and prepping students for a changing profession?
So many of my friends and colleagues know I'm at the community college. So I'm at a specific Palomar Community College, and that is the beginning of that. We, first off, as the president of the Coalition of Community College Architectural Programs, our nation needs to see that our community colleges are not stepping stones, but foundational educational requirements that can build a career upon. Many of my students at Palomar can go for the first 2 years for free or extremely subsidized. And that's the way it is in a lot of our schools across the nation. The first thing we need to do is introduce a young student to opportunities rather than saying, go to this university. You're not sure if you want to do this, but here's the student loan debt that goes along with it. Let's take a moment, slow down this process and say, here is a great avenue, a foundational institution at your local community level. See and try the classes to make sure that you like it. It's affordable. The second part of that is to make sure when they springboard from that community college into that university to continue on that either bachelor's of architecture or bachelor's of science in architecture, that we have a truly an equitable path into that transfer. The worst thing I see out there sometimes is what I call inequitable transfer agreements. When a student has already completed 2 years of their study, working part-time, they're a phenomenal student and they've got the grit because they really want to do this, then they get placed in a program at a subpar transfer agreement or a holding pattern when they put them in another program in hopes that something else opens up. Though that does not allow the students to fully utilize their time correctly. They're once again continuing the student loan debt. They're adding to that debt service, and now they're in a holding pattern till they continue. So what I like to say is a transfer agreement that doesn't place the student where they belong is really a most dangerous thing ever. In a BARC program, I only allow my students to transfer as high as a third year. I want them in that third year program. I want them at least to have a pathway. Now, I understand not every student's going to be the perfect fit for a third year designation. I respect that, and I respect our university partners in that way. But by not even having a map, there's the problem. You
Right,
show me the roadmap, and I'll show you a student who's going to basically walk down that pathway. So that's
right,
the first half of that dialogue. The
right.
second half of the dialogue is what's happening locally, both with the CCBA, the Community College Baccalaureate Association. The CCBA is now trying to help other community colleges build bachelors within their programs. Why? Because we service our regional needs, right? So now here at Palomar College, I was really proud to be awarded a Bachelor's of Science in Building Performance and Environmental Design. It's going to be akin to architecture. It's going to be aligned with architecture, but we're going to take a little different approach. So this, once again, now we're bringing equity back into that educational arena. Now our students can go 2 years at our local college for free, in our case, and then they can continue on their education here at Palomar with getting that additional competencies from NCARB, those 16 competencies. We're going to build a pathway towards licensure, and we're going to provide all this education for an astounding, if you don't believe this, Jose, between $15,000 to $17,000 to complete their baccalaureate. Now I have a student who can complete their degree and basically walk out of school with little to no student loan debt, a pathway to licensure, and basically a stepping stone for their future that is certainly accessible in today's marketplace. So
So
hopefully those are your two kind of answers, those two things, what's currently happening on a national level, and then what's happening on a personal level.
Say that one more time. So did I hear this correctly? There's an option. Today's option is somewhere in the six figures, and then you're introducing an option that could be as low as 17K. Did I hear that correctly?
Between $15,000 to $17,000, Elmore College is now going to offer a bachelor's degree in building performance and environmental design. I was astonished when we got those numbers from our chancellor's office, working with our deans and working with our president, Dr. Rivera Lacey. It just shows you what can be done at these
Right.
foundational schools, these local community colleges, when we put our minds to it. I would love to build this and show other schools across the nation and help them with their own curriculum to build these new additional pathways. And I really got to give support and a big shout out to NCARB, because they're really looking at building a wider on ramp for more architects through different types of these competency modalities. I'm happy to be on the education committee looking at these competencies and these additional learning modalities. So there's a
Right.
lot shifting, a lot happening. It's an exciting time.
Talk to me a little bit about the mechanics. So, I mean, six figures versus, and below 20K that's a drastic jump. I mean, what is happening for these education programs to bloat the cost, or what have, you and your, team have done to drive that down? I mean, what's that delta?
Well, I can't speak to other schools and their costs. Out of respect for their programs, many of these schools are phenomenal institutions with phenomenal programs. So, their costs are what they are, and I respect them, and they succeed in what they do. So I'm not judging their price point. I'm
Sure.
just challenging it with my own students, providing them an additional option. So how
Right.
did we get that? Well, there's a couple different things. One is we're funded in California through different mechanisms. We are capped at how much we can charge per unit. Additionally, our classes really dive into the construction methodology and design classes. So we don't feed a lot of other things. We don't have campus housing. We don't have a giant sports program. When it comes down to it, the people that are teaching these classes are my local friends here in San Diego. They're the presidents of architectural firms. They're the presidents of structural engineering firms like BWE and Silman Architects and HMC. It's by us as a region getting together and saying, all right, guys, what do we need here in San Diego? How do we take these classes, extrapolate, pull out what isn't needed, put in exactly what they're going to need on Tuesday, maintain that critical thinking type of education, and then run different scenarios to allow them to really stress and strain their projects. So we are fortunate because we've got a really supportive regional environment that's going to help us build it.
Yeah. It's particularly personal for me, right? I'm an example of someone who's both benefited, but also has been in some ways kind of held back through the cost of education. I had the opportunity to start at a community college myself in Florida. Did a 2-year program, was able to transfer,
Wonderful.
in this case, into University of Florida. Great, fantastic architectural program over there, and still continues to be a great one. I benefited from, at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but at the time, Florida did have kind of a scholarship program where,
Mhm.
if you hit certain targets, either 75% or 100% of your bachelor's program would be covered. I
Wow.
was fortunate enough to somehow get about 75%, um, which I think was quite literally the difference between me being able to get into it or not. From there, I continued my studies in New York. Went to Columbia, had the opportunity to study in a great program there. But as you can imagine, the cost there, I did not have a scholarship. And even hear this, despite being accepted and being allowed to skip the first year of a 3-year program, which I guess to do with my portfolio, I guess I was pretty good. Turns out I still left with well over six figures, meaning I would have left with even more had I done the 3-year program. From there, went into an incredible architectural firm. At the time, I think this was 2024. At the time, I think the starting salary was something like 55K. Now,
Mhm.
as a single man in New York at the time, I thought I was absolutely crushing it. Turns out, after a few bills came in, plus the loan bills, I was like, "Oh, I this is rough. This is rough." And I couldn't help but to take a moment to step back and say, "Well, I guess growing up, you do everything folks tell you to do. Go study, go work hard. Go focus on your studies. So you do all the check marks, and you get out and you're like, wait a minute, hold it. Like the math isn't mathing
The
here."
math isn't mathing.
And I did see, in my own experience, a rising wave, if you will, of students that are progressively realizing the same thing, that like traditional architectural path, while my first love is architecture, I quite literally can't pay my bills. And so some of the talented ones, or, just some of the savvy ones, start to think, well, wait a minute. I could get paid 3 times more if I just go from project manager to product manager at a technology company. I'm starting to see a lot of that. And for better or for worse, I don't know what that actually means in long term for the traditional architectural practice. But to pause there, I mean, it has so many downstream impacts from, I think, my own individual choices, but also just like the profession as a whole. From what I'm seeing, kind of a broader migration from traditional practice to now just actively finding alternatives paths just to make the math.
Yep. No, you're right. It's interesting. My fear is that people are pulled out of this industry because the math doesn't math, as you mentioned. My fear is that the architect starts to fall back into the shadows, right? We need to be involved in the dialogue. The role, the profession of architecture is so powerful, right? We should be at the front lines helping solve this climate emergency. We should be at the front lines in small regional areas, helping keep and maintain their unique, distinct flavor of that community. We need to be part of the planning conversations. We need to be part of the authority having jurisdictions and the building codes and the analysis of these buildings, making them better and more efficient, making these buildings run like Priuses rather than Humvees. Well, I think Humvee's electric now anyway. But so we got to make sure that our profession, the practitioner, the educator, the developer, that architecture education is still in this world because it can't fall away due to cost. You know what I mean? I think one of my favorite things I've learned over the years is when I was in school, we studied the star architect, right? Everyone wanted to be like X. I went into firms and I started to develop my own projects, and I realized that's not the way the world works. The architect or designer of a building sits more like a conductor. They understand the score, but they cannot play every single instrument. What they need to understand is the importance of the conductor to keep that whole symphony on timing and moving forward, right? To play one single piece that is the building. And once we can really reassert the power of that conductor role, and we can say it's a collaborative effort to make this building successful, we'll have a good chance of holding this profession and moving this profession forward. I think that's the shift we're seeing in a lot of schools. And that's the shift certainly I'm starting to play into my own school, which is the new role of the architect because it's such an important role.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess on that note, if we looked at the various areas from modernism, focusing on the kind of purity of materiality, and then postmodernism about kind of embedding culture back into it. And at a certain point, somewhere in the 90s, we got weird with parametricism and blobism, and we discovered the computer. And yeah, I guess at some point, performative design and whatnot and sustainability today. I'd argue, of course, the best architects can kind of synthesize the best. Of course, there's wisdom in all in terms of materiality and culture and programming and whatnot. Today, what are we talking about? What's kind of the frontline conversation here that needs to be true in pedagogy?
I believe there's only one conversation that needs to be had, and that's sustainability. I think we need to look at our buildings as machines. I think we need to find the next iteration of the building. I think some of our construction methodologies are dated. I think we can do so much more. We can see that in printing buildings. We can see that in other countries, how they can build a tighter thermal envelope. They can have a more efficient building. So we need to adopt the idea that our buildings need to operate just better. And our construction methodology needs to start to drive a regional approach. I mean, we can look at the fires in Los Angeles, right? We can look at the floods in New Orleans, right? We can look at this shifting climate, and we shouldn't be developing buildings and standards based on a uniform ideology that the building has to work in X. We really need to make sure our buildings have a building standard that looks at the regional climate emergency and start to have our codes address that. I think those two things are really where we're going to be going and where we should be going, right? A building should only be placed in one environment when it's designed correctly, right? And that is that microclimate that you're working in. So that's my personal kind of slant on it. I think we need to start training the next generation of students to look at building performance first, right?
Right,
And
right.
not just hitting the button in Revit, right? And not just hitting the button in Forma and not simply understanding the simple graphs of it, but fully understanding the implications of that building performance before the design is completely finalized. But that's the key there. Now we have all these great tools that we can study the building.
Right, right. I guess I'd ask, what have we been missing? I guess sustainability isn't particularly like a new subject, I'd argue, in the last maybe 10, 15 years. But what perspective have we been missing in driving that and really executing upon sustainability?
Well, I think it's always like the buildings we're starting to see a lot of buildings celebrated for their sustainable approach. I think that's the way to do it. I think once those buildings start rising and we start celebrating their performance, we start celebrating how innovative they are. Once we start celebrating, and we're starting to see that more and more, and I love that. I think it's starting to happen. That needs to happen at the school level as well. We're starting to see that infused in the curriculum. A great design that doesn't work isn't a successful building, right? A great form that has no regional understanding isn't a successful building, especially on a student level, because we need to ingrain that into them, that a successful building is one that responds to that microclimate that they're dealing in. That's how I always looked at it when it comes to education. And eventually we're going to get to a point where I would love to see the US be the leader in, this design construction methodology, right? I want to start seeing our students start to submit packages for disassembly. Like, one of the things we want to do in our baccalaureate is we're going to have 3 distinct studios, but one of those studios, they're going to have to design the building for a climate response and then disassemble the building. Those will be part of their sheet drawings that they'll have to submit, because that takes it in its holistic approach, right? We're celebrating them for that awesome design, as they should, because design is, such an important part of our architectural community. But we're also giving them the awards and championing their understanding that this building is going to come apart at some point in time. And how do we do this? How do we do adaptive reuse, right? The most sustainable building is the building that we don't tear down, right? One of our design studios is going to be looking at a CMU building, and they're going to have to do an adaptive reuse and then study its thermal performance and study how that building's going to integrate into the community. So by changing our studio culture a little bit, so that the successful project is not only beautiful in nature, but it's also functional in its long-term life cycle approach, and a student has to articulate that. Now we got a different version of curriculum that's going to support this new narrative that's kind of coming out.
As you're outlining this vision, it's clear that it's not only the architect. I think the architect plays a huge role, right? But as I think you pointed out, and I think one of the things that stands out about your own experience is your own background, and I think in real estate in general. Having to do with not just how we design, but how do we finance, how do we procure these buildings? What needs to be true, who are the folks around the table, in addition to the architect, that we need to make sure that we're getting around, so that if we waved our wand, right, in 5-10 years, we're doing an exceptional job, right, in terms of how we design and build. But who needs to be around the table, in your view?
I think the whole community has to be around the table. Now, I don't know if this is going to be a good thing or a bad thing. We'll let future unfold it. But I think what's going to happen, the reality of what's going to happen, is we're going to see insurance mechanisms change because of natural disasters. We're going to see financing mechanisms change because we're going to see natural disasters. So if I have a building built in the Palisades currently, and I don't build it in a construction methodology that can fight and withstand wildfires, then I'm going to see insurance premiums change. I'm going to see lending mechanisms change, because that building can't be necessarily carried for 30 years because in an event it could be destroyed because it can't keep insurance premiums affordable. So I think it's going to be a lot of that. I think we're going to look at buildings in Louisiana with flooding, and we're going to look at how they're built, and then we're going to look at how they're financed. And if they're not built the appropriate way, they're not going to be financed, or they're going to be financed at a very different rate with a very different insurance premium. So I think that's going to be some of the driving force. I think what happened is our code is starting to fall behind, and these mechanics of these natural disasters are starting to kind of take the forefront. Our code needs to jump up. I think the ICC and the IBC and our California Building Code needs to be the forerunner of that, and have some deep dives into regional construction methodologies and how these buildings are built, in these kind of natural disasters. So I think it's a little bit of that. I think you're going to have the architect, the engineer, the brokers, and of course our insurance regulators are going to be involved at that table.
Yeah. So as you prep these students for that world, take us inside to the classroom. I've had the privilege of having some incredible professors, but that have been in completely opposite sides of the spectrum. And I'll give you a few examples. So I have had one of my favorite professors. He a Spaniard architect. He was the type to come into studio and say, "Look, Jose, I need you to appreciate, right, the nuance of a dot, line, and plane, the distances, the difference between opacity and opaque. I need you to understand the mechanics of different moves, right? Kind of an architect's architect, if you will." And then, of course, I went to the GSAT program at the time where Mark Wigley was the dean at the time, when he was just questioning, why architecture in the first place? Why build? Totally. Yeah, so totally not about the mechanics, but rather just why are we doing anything? Both completely valid approaches. I'd argue perhaps one is a little bit more practical in terms of just like the moves of a traditional architect versus in others just like why are we doing certain things? What is your take? So your perspective is weighs quite a lot, right? Because ultimately it's, what the students are being taught. What, in your view, what's the ratio? What are we spending time on? Are we still debating, between 3D modeling or 2D drafting? Are we debating about Revit versus Rhino? Like what's kind of the ratio of conversation we're having here?
Well, first off, I love both of those architectural studios, right? That is the division, right? Define the line, and then, of course, can I build this line, right? But I look at it a very different approach. The whole thing has got to be flipped. I want my students to understand the mechanics of the environment first, right? Just like a doctor studies the body before they can become a surgeon, I want my students to understand the mechanics of that built environment first. First thing we do is we dive into code and we dive into the authority having jurisdiction and we dive into all the technical things that make a building. Thus, people will say, well, they're not being creative. And I actually would challenge that. I think they're being very creative. I want them to understand that this is grounded on earth. But then what we do is then we slowly follow them as their creativity launches, right? I always tell my students understanding a pragmatic approach to architecture does not make a building any less amazing. It just makes it buildable. That's it, right? So we start with that, studying the body, studying the actual object that we're doing. Then we let them grow into the designer that they're going to become. Some of the things I've seen over the years in my own education, it was always about the studio instructor. They granted you an A because they liked your design, right? It was a magical A. It was architects sleeping under the desks, teaching other architects how to suffer for the cause, and I'm going to grant you with this A. That is, to me, the wrong way to teach a professional because they carry that into the practice. I need to
Hmm.
suffer for the cause. I have bad time management, and the A is the only thing that gets granted upon me, right? That's not how we teach in other educational platforms, right? We wouldn't teach a lawyer that, right? So
Got it.
I want to do it the other way, and I do it the other way, and I'm really proud of our results. We teach the students the pragmatic approach to architecture. We teach them the components of the code. We teach them the authority having jurisdiction. We give them very scripted projects that grow in complexity, and then we follow them. It's a very Montessori approach. We let them take the lead in the design. We let them explore that design. I may not agree with their design approach, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's new to them, right? Let them start to mirror and chase and repeat design so they can grow as a designer within that pragmatic solution. So then what we have is students at the end of our cycle who understand the mechanics of the built form. They understand that this is going to be living in earth, but they have the freedom to express whatever they want because their grade isn't attached to my ego giving them that A because I think it's a good design. It's attached to their own fulfillment that said, I wanted to design this thing and I fought all semester to design this thing. And yeah, it may have worked and it may not have worked, but I went there. And I love that philosophy, following the student after we've laid down that classroom environment that has all the teaching tools for them to kind of dive into. That's kind of my version of it, I guess.
I absolutely love it. I think it resonates with one thing I've felt strongly for some time, and I'm sure it was some professor who told me. But in order to break the rules meaningfully, you got to know the rules in the first place, right? Before you could. And I think we've, as I make generalizations here, I'm sure, of course, there's always exceptions. The more narrow our scope of factors that we consider, the more narrow our designs, and the more it's kind of letting other folks, excluding other folks, right? So I resonate with that quite well, but it also suggests like that the very definition of an architect is broad, right? Because you're essentially suggesting you need to understand the universe. I mean, that's a tall order, right? But I guess perhaps one of the few professions that still needs to continue to be a generalist, or do you see it completely the other way? I mean, should we be gearing more towards actually what we should be doing is more specialization, or is the architect still one of the few kind of professions left as a generalist?
Well, I think what we need to realize as a profession that there's different versions of both architects and practitioners and designers, right? I can only speak to the firm I was at. I was a senior designer at Soman and I love design. That was my jam. But the gentleman sitting next to me, their jam was construction methodology. Another person sitting next to me was finance and development. They were all part of the same club, right? Nobody won the award by themselves, right? It wasn't, it was the firm's win as a collective body celebrating the awesomeness. And I think once we start to celebrate the different versions of designers that are out there in the education committee, A good colleague of mine once said, he designed factories, and the complexity of a factory was amazing. Now, he'll never win a design award. He won't be granted FAIA status, but they were complex, super, super intricate buildings, right? So that's what I would always lean to. Where is that person being celebrated in this craft? Some of the most successful firms can do the most complex things. From exterior, it may be a very simple structure, but in the interior of these things are really, really amazing forms. We as a group need to celebrate all the different iterations of that potential being. So yeah, to answer your question, maybe a generalist, but maybe we need to see ourselves in these different arenas and the different roles that we play. Does that answer that?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. Joseph, this is. I could keep going on for part 2, 3, 4, 5. This has been incredibly, incredibly fun. You've took us on a journey between your own upbringing, front lines of education, how it needs to change, the practice itself in the classroom. For those that want to support you, including myself, how do we do that? How do we follow you? I mean, what should we be looking at to continue following your journey?
Well, for all your listeners, the number one thing you can do out there is go to your local community college and support your local programs. You're going to find the most dedicated students that want to do this. They want this so bad. They'll work a part-time job, they'll work a full-time job, they'll work a night job and go to school. Some of your best future employees and some of the best future practitioners are sitting in those classrooms. So those schools need your support. They need your funds. I appreciate you funding your alma mater, but why don't you go to your local community colleges and see if you can support those next generation of students coming up? As for me, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Reach out anytime. We're here in San Diego, so the AIA is going to have a 2025 event here in San Diego. So by all means, if you're going to come out, reach out. I'll let you tour our facility. The Coalition of Community Colleges is going to host our own conference in July as well during the AIA. So if you're a community college educator, come on out. We can chat about it. If anything, hey, it's an excuse to come to San Diego. That's not that bad.
Joseph, incredibly, incredibly grateful. It's been fun.
Well, thank you so much, Jose. I appreciate it. And let's do part 2 and part 3 anytime.
We have to.